At 22 years old, Julia was no stranger to grief. Having just lost her mother to a sudden stroke, she inherited the house that had once been her sanctuary, a gift from her mother, who had passed away at the age of 47. Her mother had carefully planned her will years before, ensuring Julia would inherit their childhood home, a place that had always offered comfort during her most difficult times. Despite the sadness, Julia found solace in knowing that the house was hers, and it provided a sense of stability as she navigated the painful loss. Her relationship with her father, Robert, had always been complicated. He was a man driven by ambition, a 50-year-old businessman who valued work above all else, including his daughter. When Julia's parents divorced when she was 7, she spent half her time with her mother, the other half with her father. Though she loved her father, their bond was never as close as the one she shared with her mother. Robert's distractions, his busy career, and numerous romantic interests often left Julia feeling neglected, though she accepted it as her mother's love was more than enough to fill the void. As Julia approached adulthood, she began college, marking a new chapter in her life. Around that time, Robert made a life-altering decision. He moved to Houston for work. This meant their already infrequent visits were reduced to once or twice a year. But then, 2 years ago, Robert introduced a new woman, Emma, into the family fold. Emma, a 38-year-old woman with 2 daughters from a previous relationship, was completely unknown to Julia, and his announcement surprised her. This wasn't like the other girlfriends Robert had casually mentioned before. This was serious. Though taken aback, Julia agreed to welcome Emma and her daughters, 18-year-old Sarah and 16-year-old Mia, into their Christmas celebration. Despite the initial awkwardness, the evening went surprisingly well. Julia found herself charmed by Emma's warmth and kindness, while Sarah and Mia, though quiet, seemed to fit in just fine. Over time, Julia grew to appreciate the companionship Emma and her daughters offered, and they began to form a bond. Still, she remained closer to her mother, the one person she could always count on. When Julia's mother passed, the grief was unbearable. Yet, amidst the sorrow, there was one unexpected blessing. Her mother had left her the house. It was an inheritance that would forever connect Julia to her mother. And after a few months of mourning, Julia decided to move back in, settling into the house she had grown up in. Her father, Robert, was less than thrilled about the will. He had always considered the house his. After all, he and Julia's mother had bought it together, and it was meant to be theirs. But now, with Julia's inheritance, he found himself on the outside looking in. Despite his feelings of resentment, Robert kept his disappointment to himself, focusing on his new life in Houston. A few weeks after the funeral, he and Emma returned to announce that they were engaged and planning a wedding. They were hoping to stay in Julia's house during the wedding preparations since it was large enough to accommodate them. Julia, not wanting to feel alone during such a tumultuous time, agreed to let them stay. Besides, Robert promised to cover all the bills, easing the burden on her finances. Living together in the house at first felt like a temporary arrangement. But over the next month, Julia found herself growing accustomed to the noise of Emma's 2 daughters, the constant chatter at the dinner table, and the shared responsibilities of a household that had once been entirely her own. Though she enjoyed their company, she couldn't shake the feeling of being invaded. The day they left for the wedding came with a bittersweet relief. Julia enjoyed the idea of solitude once again, but she couldn't ignore the growing sense of anxiety about their request to stay permanently. It was 3 days before the wedding when Robert approached her with an unexpected proposition. He asked if she would allow Emma and her daughters to move in with her permanently. Julia, unsure of how to react, was torn. On one hand, she didn't want to be alone, and having family around seemed comforting. On the other hand, she couldn't ignore the gut feeling that this arrangement wasn't in her best interest. After much internal conflict, Julia told Robert she needed time to think, promising to give him an answer after the wedding. When the wedding finally arrived, Julia kept to her word and didn't voice her concerns, but deep down, she felt uncertain about the whole situation. The days that followed the wedding felt like a strange limbo. She had hoped to discuss everything once they were settled. But then, 2 days after the wedding, something shocking happened. Robert, Emma, and the girls left for their honeymoon without telling Julia. Waking up to an empty house, Julia was initially shocked. She tried calling Robert, but his phone went unanswered. It wasn't until noon that Emma finally returned her call, casually informing her that they had left for the honeymoon and would be gone for a week. Julia, already feeling hurt by the lack of communication, was offended. She had expected at least a farewell, a sign of respect for her as a member of the family. But instead, she was left in the dark. When she confronted Emma about it, Emma's response was dismissive. "We just forgot to tell you," she said, as though it were no big deal. Julia tried to explain her frustration, but Emma's tone shifted abruptly. She grew cold, telling Julia that her father was too busy to speak to her and that she needed to stop acting like a child. Her words stung, and the reality of Emma's true nature began to set in. The woman who had once been so kind was now unrecognizable. Infuriated, Julia made a decision. She would no longer allow these people to take advantage of her. In a fit of frustration, she packed up their belongings, carelessly and with as much disregard as she felt they deserved, and dumped it all in the yard. She didn't care what happened to it. It wasn't hers, and it didn't belong in her house. When Robert and Emma returned from their honeymoon, they were met with the sight of their belongings strewn across the yard. Julia had also changed the locks on the door. Robert called her, enraged, accusing her of being spoiled and overreacting. But Julia remained calm. She told him to take his boxes and leave, and if they didn't, she'd call the police. Robert was furious, but she was unshaken. Later that night, Robert called again. This time, Emma had something to say. She apologized for her behavior and begged for a second chance. But Julia was resolute. She wasn't going to let them back into her life with fake apologies. If they truly cared, they would have apologized sooner. Julia wasn't about to be manipulated. The final blow came when Robert, crying on the phone, accused her of being selfish for not allowing him and his new family to move back in. He claimed that the house held sentimental value for him, a place filled with memories of happier times with Julia's mother. But Julia saw through the manipulation. It wasn't about the house. It was about control. He had never really respected her or her needs, and now he was trying to guilt-trip her into letting them back into her home. In the end, Julia stood her ground. She wasn't going to sacrifice her peace of mind just to accommodate people who hadn't shown her the same respect. She didn't regret her decision, not for a second. Julia knew she had made the right decision. Her father's attempt to manipulate her had only confirmed what she already suspected. He never truly valued her or her inheritance. The house was more than just a building. It was a symbol of her independence, her mother's love, and the life she had fought to rebuild. No one, not even her father, was going to take that from her. And as for Emma and her daughters, Julia didn't need them in her life. She was better off on her own, even if it meant facing the world alone. She didn't need a family that treated her like an afterthought. She would find her peace elsewhere. The house was hers, and it always would be.